All right, everyone. So now we're going to go ahead to part two, ancient Egypt. The first part, of course, we focused on the geography. We talked about the Archaic period, all the important things during the Archaic period. I want to kind of briefly run through the other time periods as well, starting with the Old Kingdom. And this image here is of the Sphinx and, of course, one of the many pyramids built during the Old Kingdom, the Giza Pyramid. So let's talk about this a bit. So, during the Old Kingdom, two things. One, the pharaohs were now considered gods. And because the pharaohs were considered gods, that ties into this idea of building these massive pyramids. What were these pyramids? Well, these pyramids were tombs for their pharaohs, right? Who they saw as a god. One of the most famous is the Giza one, and it was specifically built for this pharaoh named Khufu. The thing is with the Old Kingdom and the pharaohs and these building these pyramids, there've been so many stories about them and details about them and mystery about them, right? Because like who built them and how were built and all of that. And one common misconception is that there were slaves that built the pyramids. Well, that's pretty much been debunked. We have some ancient Greek sources that talk about slaves building it and that kind of stuff. But the reason that was debunked is because a couple things. One is we've found, like etchings inside of the pyramids of the workers, and when they've translated these etchings, they're people proud of what they're doing. They show pride in their work and jokes and all that. You wouldn't do that if you were a slave. The other factor is it doesn't seem like Egypt had a lot of slaves during the Old Kingdom. Egypt will have slaves, that comes a little bit later. So more than likely, these were simply built by the people in Egypt as massive building projects for their pharaoh, who was seen as a god. So that's I think one thing I think important to note that it wasn't built by slaves. Instead, it was built by the Egyptian people. The other thing that it shows us is the political and economic and agricultural stability Egypt must have had to build, not just one of these, but many of these. Excuse me, many of these pyramids during this time. And so that's I think pretty important as well. That's what that kind of indicates that they had that stability. So that's one. And then other details about it are amazing. The millions of blocks involved in building these pyramids, moving them. If you know how to look at the pyramids correctly, you can tell you which way is due north, due south, due east, due west. So there's the science behind it as well, which leads to the question of how are they built? And no one knows for sure. That we don't know for sure. There are these people we sometimes call pyramidiots that they say, Elvis flying the spaceship built the pyramids and all that with the aliens and all that nonsense. No one really knows for sure. There are different theories of how it could be done. A friend of mine worked on with a lady wrote a book about how they built the pyramids with kites and they used big kites to lift up the stones, and they actually went to the desert and lifted stones up with kites. But just because you can do it some way doesn't mean they did. We don't have any blueprints. But what it does show us is that there's, definitely, different theories of how it was done. I don't know if, I'm sure several people say, I know for sure, but I don't know if anybody really knows for sure of how they were built. But it does show the great success that Egypt had during the Old Kingdom. So that's it. That's all I really want you to know about the Old Kingdom time period. And just kind of know that era of building the big pyramids, and obviously Khufu the pharaoh was built for, and those few little details I gave you on it, and you're good. What happens after the Old Kingdom? Well, let's move on. So here we have again keywords: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom. So we have the Giza pyramid, which we just talked about, and then after the Old Kingdom, you get to this period known as the first illness. And again, I put all the dates in the first one. You don't need to I didn't put all the dates down again for all these, but if you watch the first part, you should have all those dates already written down for you. And again, you don't need to memorize the exact dates or anything. But the first illness, or the first intermediate period, it's sometimes called the first intermediate period, sometimes called the first illness. That's when Egypt stops being united for a short time period during this era, where for, let's say, about 100 years or so, they fragment into different parts instead of being united. Seems to happen from some sort of internal issues. And that's all you need to know. Then we get to the Middle Kingdom, right? So by the time we get to roughly, 2500 BC, we're in the Middle Kingdom. And during this Middle Kingdom period, they basically reunite. And, that's when Egypt comes together, they reunite and establish themselves as a strong, strong civilization again, united. During the Middle Kingdom, they don't really build a lot of big pyramids anymore. It seems like they build more temples, a lot of canal building, more practical things are built during the Middle Kingdom. Sometimes people say, especially the canal building, using the Nile more effectively. And again, that's it. I don't spend a lot of time on these other time periods. And again, I go through all these lectures pretty quickly for any of my students or anybody else watching these lectures. And remember, this is for a survey course. So if you were to take a whole course on ancient Egypt, you would get into a lot more detail on all of this. And so then we get into what we call the second illness or the second intermediate period. And this is interesting because during the second illness, something happens to Egypt that has not happened since really its dawn in 3100 BC. What could have happened? Well, they're invaded. They're invaded likely by a group of people known as the Hyksos, these nomadic warriors that bring about a bit of destruction and havoc inside of Egypt. And you go, well, how did they do this? And one of the thinkings is that, for a long time, Egypt never really developed a huge army because they really didn't need a huge army, right? They had the desert, they were protected. Well, now they're being invaded by these nomadic warriors, these Hyksos. Once they're invaded, Egypt is going to then use the resources that they had used for pyramids and canal building and temples and begin to use those resources seemingly a lot more for an army. And once they create an army, they kind of either push the Hyksos out. I've read some accounts that the Hyksos were absorbed into Egyptian civilization and they kind of absorbed some of their military technology as well. And they have an army taking us to the New Kingdom. But when you have an army, then you tend to use it. And so the last big period I want to talk about is the New Kingdom, which is also sometimes referred to as the Empire Kingdom. So let's go to our next slide here. So on this slide, we see the Empire Kingdom and the key words. And as you say, the map looks the same, right? But I'm going to kind of explain this now. What we've been looking at on this map here is this area that's more the dark green color, I guess you could say. That's Egypt that I just circled. That's Egypt, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, right? Taking us to about the 1800 BC time period, 1700 BC time period. And then that's the area we've been talking about. During the New Kingdom, they're going to expand down south, which gets cut off on this map, towards the Nubian Desert. But way up here north, this whole region known as the Levant. If you know that term, that's fine. If you don't know that term, that's okay. And they conquer this whole massive area there, basically doubling the size of Egypt geographically, almost doubling it, right? And so there are a few pharaohs during the New Kingdom that I want you to know. And the first one, and they're all for different reasons I want you to know them, is Thutmose III. He was the one most responsible for the expansion. Sometimes he's kind of nicknamed the Napoleon of ancient Egypt because he's the one who's known for launching all these campaigns. I think like dozen plus, about 18 maybe campaigns up north and conquering this whole area. Now, interestingly, this is, of course, you say, well, who lives in this area over here? And for anybody who knows this region, and I cover this in a lot more detail in my History of the Middle East class, this is, of course, the area of the ancient Hebrew people. This is where the first people living there, the indigenous Jewish people, were living in this area, Judea. We're going to have a little lecture on them as well and talk about all that in upcoming lectures. But this is perhaps where you get the stories of the Jewish people being enslaved by the Egyptians, right? It's more likely during this time period. So they go and they conquer this area, and Thutmose III is the one most responsible for that. All right, so that's what you mainly need to know about him. So if I ask you which pharaoh is the most responsible for the expansion of the New Kingdom, it was Thutmose III. He was the one who conquered the most land. Now, as we move chronologically, there's another interesting pharaoh named Akhenaten, and some students have heard of him before. And again, you have the circa dates, which again, I'm never going to test you on the dates, but I do want you to know what he does, because he does something unique to Egyptian history up to this point. Remember when I talked about the Archaic period, I said Egypt was polytheistic? Well, during Akhenaten's time, he's going to develop a monotheistic religion. And he's going to say, no, 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 we're only going to worship one God. It doesn't really stick around very long. It kind of dies when he dies. Again, some people speculate maybe this was influenced by the Hebrews, the Jewish people, who again in another lecture we'll talk about. It's a monotheistic religion. Maybe from there, but it's just kind of an interesting twist in Egyptian history that him, along with his wife, a woman named Nefertiti, don't need to worry about her again. This is just, again, survey. I go through this very quickly, but I do want you to know Akhenaten developed this religion. Then we get to the last pharaoh I want you to know, and that's a man named Ramses II. And he's one of the more famous pharaohs of Egyptian history. And look at the dates. Again, you don't need to memorize the dates, but look how long he ruled. He was pharaoh for a good 70 years. That's a long time. I mean, we get presidents for 8 years, and we're done, go away. So 70 years, the same guy in charge. And he's described as being very powerful, very strong individual. There's of course stories of Ramses and Moses, and this is where you get into the biblical stuff as well. This is again something I cover more in the history of the Middle East class when I talk more detail about the Hebrews. But for our purposes, just know that Ramses was a very strong king of the Egyptians. We are going to talk about him one more time in another lecture because he's going to be involved in a war with another civilization during this time period. But long story short, he was strong and capable. And then he died. And when he died, there was no one to fill his shoes. I mean, interesting, he was a very busy guy. I think he had 111 sons and 51 daughters, and, obviously not from the same wife. But when I say no one to fill his shoes, obviously he had plenty of sons, but no one to be that strong figure. And so what ended up happening is he leaves, and then there's just weak leadership, apparently. And this weak leadership happens very close to around the year 1200 BC. Notice the date. And I mentioned that year before, 1200. And this year 1200 BC is going to come up a few times. And again, you don't need to memorize dates, but this is one you want to pay attention to. Because around 1200 BC, something happens. A group of people, simply known as the Sea People, that's all they're known as, is the Sea People, invade Egypt. And when they invade Egypt in 1200 BC, they bring Egypt into a dark age. In my class, I just shut off all the lights, and the lights turn dark in the room, and it's pitch dark in there. But a dark age. Everything just goes black. And what does that mean, a dark age? Well, we're going to see this term dark ages several times, and essentially the term dark age means the characteristics of civilizations disappear. The writing, the political organization, the monumental architectures, the cities, all of that is gone. And so these Sea People come in and they end Egypt as we knew it, ancient Egypt. Egypt will come back after the Dark Ages, but it'll be kind of a shell of its former self. It will be vulnerable to other civilizations. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, all these other powers are going to have their turn taking control of Egypt, the Ottomans and so forth. And it's never going to be the same. And the Sea People seem to be the one who do it. Now, who are the Sea People? And the answer is we really don't know much. The more reading I've done on it, it's like maybe a whole group of different people coming in together, attacking. We don't know really where they came from, who they were. All we have are accounts of quote-unquote Sea People invading, and then the lights go off. And what we're going to see is the lights go off everywhere around the Mediterranean Sea around 1200 BC. So for a group of people we don't know very much about, they seem to have wreaked havoc on a number of civilizations. Now, we also know about 1200 BC, there were several natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanoes, may have played a role impacting civilizations as well around that time. But at the end of the day, 1200 BC just marks a very sudden end to the ancient Egyptians. And so the Egyptian civilization comes to an end. Again, we're going to still talk about this land in terms of other civilizations being there, like the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans and so forth. But that's it, right? So it's kind of one of those great little mysteries. People are researching, trying to see more about Sea People information. So that's it. That's what you need to know about the other periods, right? The Old Kingdom, Middle, the intermediate periods I gave you, and then during the New Kingdom, just those three pharaohs. Just know a little bit about each one, just those things I mentioned, and you're good to go. So then the question is what happens after the Dark Ages, and are there other areas of civilizations developing? And of course, the answers to that is yes, and that's what we're going to cover in subsequent lectures. All right, so I hope all that was clear. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. Make sure you're taking all the notes. Remember, you can always go back, watch these lectures again. And that's it. All right. Have a good one, everyone. Thank you.